My name is Gunnar Black. There isn't much time left for me. Frankly, there isn't much time left for anybody. But if you're reading this, then perhaps this isn't the apocalypse it seems. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm new to this whole final days logbook sort of thing. Let me explain how this all started. Thinking back, I suppose that it was several weeks ago when all this trouble with technology began. It was just a minor inconvenience at first. I'd be watching some TV or playing some Team Fortress 2 when suddenly my computer would shut off. Other times I'd be cooking something in the oven and it'd turn off halfway through, leaving me with uncooked meatloaf. It was truly a travesty. I called an electrician who said that the wiring in my dorm was all in working order. Oh, that's right. If you couldn't put two and two together based on where you found this journal, then I'd like to state that I am in the United States Air Force. And that's why I live in a very old dorm. Anyways, not believing him, I called several more electricians, even an on-base technician, and everybody said the same thing. I tried to use less electricity to give the wiring a break, and still the problems continued. Occasionally, I would purposely leave everything off for hours at a time in some hope that the problem would just go away, and it didn't. Eventually, I learned to live with it, and I just assumed it was just the old building finally giving its death croak. Something that struck me as odd, though. Some of the people in my squadron began having similar experiences. The airman who sat next to me in my office told me that her phone would simply die randomly, regardless of the battery, and come to life minutes later. I learned that this wasn't just affecting me. It was affecting everybody. Several days later, similar stories were appearing on the news. They told us that the problem would be fixed. They told us everything would be back to normal. They told us that everything would be okay. Even back then, I didn't believe them. Many areas across the country, in fact, the world, were suffering from such issues. And soon, things took a turn for the sour. At this point, everyone was just getting used to the whole ordeal. One or two things not working at a time, it became commonplace. It would just be a blender here or a radio there. We learned to adapt. But suddenly, nothing would work, and everything would be off. And this would go on for hours at a time. Civil unrest began to develop, and the paranoia grew. There was no explanation. The media couldn't tell us why. Like they ever explained anything anyways. Nor could any electrician. Hell, even the tech experts on base came up empty. Next, the generator started failing. Most schools and office buildings have backup power generators, and even some private homes have generators for when the electricity goes out. They were working just fine, and became a haven of sorts for those of us without light. Alas, like everything else, they began to stop. There wasn't some grand explosion or some shower of sparks. Nothing internally was broken either, they just stopped. People were complaining that their children had to go to school in complete darkness on some days, until it was cancelled. I can remember having to navigate my way through an office building with nothing but a lighter and some hope. This was more than a minor issue, since many gate and doors on the military base are electronically locked every time they close. From what I heard, some people were sealed in rooms for days on end. When the lights stopped turning back on, people began to lose it. No amount of token solutions or false promises would help anybody anymore. The media blackout is what really started to set civilization over the edge. Nobody knew anything, and even the government, and not even the government had the ability to try and soothe our fears anymore. Our commanders tried everything to get the base populace under control, with no real results. I mean, really, how could they expect to gather us all in one place? All communication was gone. Eventually, the mental breakdowns began. People screaming that they were hearing or seeing things. The airman who who was across the deck from me, must have had it bad. She seemed to have completely lost it and began to attack people at random with a knife. Or so I heard, since by then our building had completely lost power. Don't even get me started on the human pyramid that we had to form so we could get over the security gate. Society began to collapse. Electronics were a necessity in this day and age. It kept the human race connected and in communication. From what I could tell, it also kept our sanity good and healthy, seeing as how most seemed to have lost that without these things. Well, we were seeing what was happening. I stopped going to work, not that I could get past the doors, mind you, and no one was really going anywhere anyways, since no vehicles were functioning. People were staying at home, hoarding foods and supplies, while taking care of those who suffered from panic attacks. People were staying at home, hoarding food and supplies, while taking care of those who suffered from panic attacks. The government shut down, water stopped running. It was as if mankind was thrust 500 years back. During the day, the only time that there was light now, I saw an airman collapse on my lawn. I rushed out to help him, but as soon as I got near him, he started screaming and thrashing about. "The lights! We need the lights!" he yelled. And truly, that will forever haunt my memory. Though at least that won't be a problem soon. I was afraid to approach him, for good reason as well, since his screams only got more frantic and less sane. "They'll come! They'll come!" And that was the only thing that really stood out to me. What could he mean? I learned soon enough. His ramblings only got more loud and less intelligent to the point that where he simply began screaming for several minutes. And for one reason or another, the screaming stopped, and he was dead. I saw no physical damage. Could it have been something internal? Anyways, I didn't want to leave him on my lawn, but I couldn't call security forces, and I'd never seen him on base before. I ended up dragging him to the security force squadron across the base, even though I knew nobody would be there. Most abandoned their posts and went to be with their families. But those with a greater sense of duty, or those with no family, were attempting to quell riots with varying success. By the time I made my way back home, the sun was setting. I felt my hair stand on end as I rushed back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. The fall of mankind was surprisingly interesting to watch. After merely 2 weeks without power, huge changes had occurred. The government had been all but abolished. They still tried to maintain their pointless laws, but with no way to enforce them, it was a wasted effort. The police force had been disbanded after only a few days. We in the military didn't fare much better. Barely anybody even tried to do their job anymore. The only reason that we were still on base was because, for many, it was our home. Off base, it was utter anarchy. The few times I ventured off, I feared for my life. There were houses with boarded up windows and dogs chained to the front doors. There were thugs armed with knives and bats, looting and raping as they pleased. Corpses were fairly commonplace in the streets, some with heads bashed in, some with stab wounds, and a few mangled beyond all recognition. Those are the ones that made me worry. I wondered how a human could do such a thing. To destroy a person so thoroughly that no inch was left untouched. It just became too much for me. The sight of those kills shattered my view of humanity in an instant. And after one final supply run, I stopped leaving my room. It was a bleak time for me. There were still people living their lives around me. Some people were insane, some were ruthless, and others were in denial, believing that somehow things would turn around. I ignored them all. After seeing what I thought to be the worst of mankind, I wanted nothing to do with my race anymore. One afternoon, I found another body in front of my room. I merely laughed and dragged it just far away enough so that the flies wouldn't be attracted to my room. I wondered what sins he had committed during this time without light. The way I saw things, no one was innocent, and I couldn't care less. Without power, mankind was reduced to barbarism. Simply put, we were reduced to mere animals in less than a month. No better than the flies that fester around the corpses that we created. An hour later, I was almost drifting off to sleep. Frankly, I couldn't do much else those days. But then I heard it. It was a blood-curdling scream coming a few doors down. While screams were a fairly common thing, that one was different. The screams I was used to were those of the insane. Fear was either abolished or became the norm some time ago for the majority of people. It would take something utterly shocking to stir up true fear again, and I couldn't imagine what would cause that. I shot up in bed and ran as fast as I could to the dorm. A few others joined me as we waited to see what was wrong. Strangely, no one came to the door, and no one cried for help. One of the airmen who had come to help decided to check it out. He tried knocking down the door with little to show, and went through the window instead. The darkness of the room seemed to swallow him, and in an instant, we could no longer see him. A few seconds later, we heard a scream, and it was closer this time. We heard something new. We heard the noises. A few seconds later, we heard his scream, and as we were closer this time, we heard something new. We heard the noises of flesh being torn from bone, of inhuman laughter, of blood hitting the walls, and then silence. Deathly silence. The moments following that were a panic-induced blur. I sprinted as fast as I could back to my room. I took 1 second to glance out my window, and that was all I needed to forever burn the image of a nightmarish creature into my skull. I remembered its bright white eyeballs, its gore-covered teeth, and I remembered its seemingly formless black body, matching the night in which it dwells. Well, now that you're all caught up, I'm still in my room now. I've spent the last few hours writing the downfall of mankind for God knows whatever reason, serenaded by the sounds of screaming, yelling, and unearthly silence. The smart ones are in hiding, waiting in their rooms, praying for the day. The ones in the streets are getting systematically slaughtered. Some fools are even trying to fight them off. About an hour ago, though, I made an interesting discovery, even if it's all for naught at this point. From the safety of my room, I watched the combat outside. Physical contact doesn't seem to affect the creatures in the slightest. In fact, the blows just seemed to go right through them. The desperate airman outside had managed to piece together a makeshift torch and lit it with a match. Immediately, all the creatures backed away from him. The airman, realizing that he was onto something, sprinted as fast as he could towards one of the beings. Unable to flee fast enough, the being bellowed an ungodly scream and vanished into nothingness, leaving nothing but a smoking scorch mark on the ground. Alas, luck was not on his side this night. A storm had been brewing all day, and it finally unleashed its payload with unrelenting fury. The flame dimmed and died within seconds, leaving the desperate airman to his grisly fate. I watched no more. I've seen enough death this night. I've had time to think, too. This is why we're afraid of the dark, isn't it? These beings are the dark, the night, the pitch black. Have they always been here? There's no way to know now, but it makes sense. Light kills them. That's why they didn't attack during the day. Synthetic light must kill them as well, or else we would have seen them before. The ravaged bodies that I saw off base, could they have been the result of these monsters? Perhaps mankind isn't as monstrous as I thought. On the other hand, if light kills them so easily, then why don't the moon or stars have any effect on them? Is it because the moon and the stars are creatures of the night as well? Why didn't they attack in the weeks leading up to tonight? Were they simply biding their time? Or is the unexpected failing of technology as surprising to them as it was to us? In fact, where were they all this time? All these questions, I wish that we had time to learn of them. If we did, we may have stood a chance. If I can hold out for a few more hours, daylight will come. Maybe even help will come. They won't be able to attack me for a dozen hours, or even more. I'll be safe. But that probably won't happen, since I can hear them outside right now. They're coming for me, and that locked door isn't gonna hold them off. I'm gonna suffer the same fate as those people outside. What help could anybody give at this point? We have nothing, no light at all. Perhaps the other survivors and I... Oh, who am I kidding? If these creatures can make it onto a military base, then there's little else that they can't reach. They're clawing at my door now. I can hear them over the storm raging outside. Are they laughing? Is this merely a game to them? I've got a knife in my hand, but what good will that do? My forced documentation of these events is all that's keeping me from going into a full-blown panic. I can see them breaking through now. Rain pouring through the fresh hole in my door. It's flashing those teeth at me. Forget the knife. Why bother?